It's good to be with you again this morning as your guest preacher on this spring break morning. I've noticed a trend in my recent sermon topics. I preached on the 4th of July, so I had the pleasure of preaching politics from the pulpit, which is always fun to hear. This morning, our focus is on the laborers in the vineyard, so get ready for questions about economic fairness, justice, and equality. Nothing controversial there. Next time, I'm sure I'll be asked to preach about death and taxes just to make sure that having committed every known conversational faux pas, I am never asked into anyone's living room for tea ever again, in person or otherwise. But when speaking about the parables of Jesus, it is nice to be behind a pulpit where no one can argue with you, except through anonymous notes that go to Connie anyway. In some ways, I think Jesus also enjoyed this power over the listener because he definitely liked to subvert our expectations and play with our minds a little bit. I don't know how his followers put up with it, really. I know if I were one of Jesus' contemporary disciples, by about the 4th or 5th parable, having had Jesus pull the rug out from under me 4 or 5 times, I'd be throwing my hands in the air and questioning him like a 6-year-old. Jesus would begin to say, "The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner," and I'd say, "Why?" He'd continue, "Who went out early into the morning?" "But why?" I'd ask. "To hire laborers for his vineyard." "But why?" "Because he needed workers." "Why?" "Because he needed someone to plant the grapes." "Why?" "Because otherwise there wouldn't be any grapes in his vineyard." "Well, why?" "Because that's not how nature works." "Why?" "Because that's not how God works." "Well, then tell me how God does work." And Jesus would say, "God is like a landowner who goes out early in the morning." And I'd be back where I started. So it's good the disciples didn't act this way, but listened intently. Because the parables have such rich layers of meaning that we can learn so much from them in so many ways. And sure, sometimes the disciples heard a different message than what Jesus may have intended, but that's how parables work as well. When studying a parable, it is always good to look at the context. Jesus was often less like a preacher and more like a friend you go on a walk with who starts musing as you amble along and you think he's talking about weather or nature, and you realize once you start paying attention a little bit more, he's actually unveiling the secrets of the universe. And you didn't know until now, and you wish you would have listened from the beginning. That's how Jesus was. He's just walking along with his disciples, hoping that they paid attention to him. And mostly they did. He had them on their toes. So why does Jesus tell this story here? Well, in this context, Jesus is walking through an area, and he's stopped a couple of times. First, he's tested by the Pharisees, and then he just has a rich man leave him sadly, because he wouldn't give up all his earthly possessions and give that money to the poor. And then Jesus has just heard the disciples tell him all that they have given up to follow him. And Jesus has encouraged them in this, built them up, and in affirming them, said words that we are very familiar with. Many who are last will be first. Did I say that wrong? Many who are last will be first, and the first will be last. That's what he said, right? And then he tells this parable. After the parable's conclusion, Jesus predicts his own death, as he is wont to do, letting the disciples know there are some pretty bad things coming on the way. And then after that, we have a story about the mother of James and John, who approaches Jesus and asks him, and the irony is not lost here, to honor her sons above all others, to make them first. So let's ask again, why is this story, this parable, located here? Is it to further chastise the rich young man's perspective? Or to continue to challenge the Pharisees? Or is he tying this in with his own prediction of death, that even he will be made low? So what situation does the parable relate to? And Jesus would answer, yes, because it can relate to all of those stories in some way. Because when we attempt to interpret a parable, we can find meaning in one way. But then we may shift our perspective, turn the parable, and look at it from a different angle. It can mean something else. and it can mean something different to someone else. These meanings are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Parables are prisms. They are light refracted in so many ways. So this morning I'm going to share with you what I think about the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. And since parables are supposed to be evocative, to evoke emotion, I'm going to ask you to share a bit about your interpretation as well. Then we'll depart amicably, and my hope is, by this afternoon, you've turned the parable in your mind again and seen something else. And then by evening, turned it again to realize something new about the kingdom of heaven as we understand it. And then to keep doing this many times at different hours throughout the days, just like our vineyard owner who goes out so many times to find new workers. So here we lay our scene. The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. This story, like any good story, can be broken into 3 exact sections that build tension on each other and should make the reader feel more and more anxious about what's to come. In this parable, the first part is the job search. The second is the payment of wages, and the third is the grumbling of the first hired workers and their conversation with the owner. Act 1 starts innocuously enough. A vineyard owner needs workers for his vineyard, and he goes out to find them. But already here, some of Jesus' audience would find that odd. Why does a landowner, who presumably has people working for him, probably servants in the household and things, why does he go out into the marketplace to hire new workers, especially going early in the morning? Why is it him? Then he agrees to a wage with the workers. He barters with them. He negotiates with them. Why? He's hiring them. Why doesn't he just state his price and see if they accept it? He is the one in power, and yet he bargains. It's a bit off for a landowner of this day. And in terms of the setting, there are some gaps too. We know the time of day each time, but we do not know the season, which is pretty important for a story about a vineyard. Is it harvest time? Are we planting? Are we pruning? We don't know. We're left to make an assumption. Now let's pause here. At different parts in the story, it will be important for us to pause and check in with each other about our reaction as an audience of listeners. So I'll ask you, by show of hands, when you heard this story read beautifully, and when you heard me mention the lack of a setting, who or where in your mind did you go? What time of season did you go to? Do you think, hearing this parable, did your mind go to a season of harvest? Or did it go to planting or pruning? Or did it go to just a regular day sometime in August? So who thought harvest as soon as you heard it? Oh, wait, don't judge each other. No side eyes here. It's fine. Who thought planting? What about pruning? Kind of the same thing, yeah. And a regular day, just a regular old day, Jesus doesn't participate in. Yep, good. So that's important because it starts to set up how we see the parable and how we add that significance to it. Because once we add these layers, we do that sometimes unintentionally. So calling ourselves back to it and going, what were my assumptions? Calls you back to, why did I have those assumptions? Okay. So after the landowner hires the workers, he goes back a few hours later and he finds more people standing idly in the marketplace. It's important to note here that it directly says he finds them idle. They're not coming from another job that they've wrapped up already. He hires these people and sends them out into the vineyard, but this time he promises to pay them, in his words, whatever is right. And the word used for right here has about the same context and meaning as when we say a phrase like do right by someone else, or even do right by God. There's kind of a holy phrase to this, or tone to it. So then he goes out a couple more times at noon and 3 o'clock, and then at 5 o'clock he goes out again in the last hour of the day and sees more workers standing idly. This time he has to ask, "Why are you still standing here?" And they tell him, "Because no one has hired us." By this, they could mean several things. They could be being a bit defensive, saying, well, it's not our fault. No one hired us. Or they could look at him dumbfounded and restate the obvious, because no one has hired us. Duh. Or they could look at him pleadingly, because no one else has hired us. We haven't been seen by anyone else. Or it could mean any number of other things. The way that we interpret their response, though, is connected to how we have heard the landowner's question. And that can change the way we hear the rest of the parable. We'll get into that. So let's check in again. Let's use our hands. And then for those watching and playing along at home, you can type your response into the comment section, but please be civil. We promise not to start a riot in the sanctuary if you promise not to do one at home. So of those three options, the reactions of, or the response of the workers, how did you hear their response? Their response of, because no one has hired us. Did you hear them being defensive, stating the obvious, or pleading? So how many of you felt their words being defensive? Well, nobody hired us. It's not our fault. What about stating the obvious? Look, no one's hired us. Of course we're standing here. Did anybody hear a pleading tone? We didn't get hired. Okay. This, depending on how we hear that, it means we heard the landowner either ask, you lazy fools, why are you standing here idle all day? Or, you know there's work to be done. Why are you all just standing here? Or, tell me why this is happening to you. Tell me why you're here in this situation. So when we hear that call and response, we think of the parable differently. Know those assumptions that you're making and hear them now. Because as we continue on, they will come up again. The second act begins with some normalcy. The workday is over, and the owner tells his manager to pay the workers. Finally, an owner acting as an owner, telling his steward to pay them instead of doing it himself. Breath of fresh air. Normalcy. Great. But no. We're back to the strangeness again immediately, because he tells the manager to pay the workers, beginning with the last ones hired and moving to the first. One of Jesus' contemporaries must have been pulling her hair out. Why aren't the first ones paid first? They've been here the longest. Why is the owner making them wait for everyone else to get paid? By this point, it seems Jesus is intentionally agitating his audience, which is important to note, and so the tension mounts. Oh, but wait. Sure, the first hired are having to watch everyone else get paid, but look, the last hired workers are getting a full day's wage. All right, they must have thought, maybe it's good I get to watch. This owner is clearly pretty generous. If they're getting a day's pay, how much more is he going to pay me? First hired, relax a bit. A reward for good labor is coming. We can almost hear the words, well done, you good and faithful servant, dripping out of the owner's mouth. We are moving on up to the east side. We're going to finally get our piece of the pie. So how much do you think they might hope to get? At least a day and a half pay, right? At least. They got a full day's wage. They were here an hour. We got to get at least a day and a half. It really should be 2 days, right? Should at least be 2 days. Or, if we're really going to think about it, we were here 11 hours longer than they were. We should get 11 days pay for this, right? But no, they get 1 day's wage as well. Sorry, not sorry. So they start to grumble. A wonderful biblical tradition, the grumbling. This is the beginning of our third act. These last only worked 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, they say. Who, we might add, have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat. We have a little bit more of an image of the setting there. The burden of the day and the scorching heat. Let's pause one last time. Let's check in with each other about how we would have reacted if we were the first hired, the toilers, the sun-scorched, because this is a doozy. Now, I'm going to assume that most of us can agree with the workers' reactions, unless you're a living saint like my mother, wink. We don't need a show of hands this time. If you are so bold, I would like to hear some shout-outs about just how you would be feeling. What emotion would you be experiencing if you were the first hired? And I'll repeat your response so we can follow at home as well. How would you be feeling? What's a word that evokes in you? What emotion comes up? That's not fair. Cheated. Resentful. Say it again. How dare they? Angry, right? Angry. What else boils up? Disappointed. Can you feel a kind of seething rage? Why? Wouldn't it be great if we could just let those emotions fester? Who doesn't love a good, righteous festering? Oh, just wonderful. Just live in the anger and discontent. But it's not to be. The landowner says, friend, I am doing you no wrong, says you. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Maybe. Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Each parable has a crux, a moment which shocks, dumbfounds, and unsettles us. And this is that moment for this parable. The owner says, am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? Am I not allowed to do what I choose? Are you envious because I am generous? Or maybe he's saying, are you jealous because I have the ability to choose how I am generous? Or maybe they're hearing, are you envious that I can be generous at all, that I have the means to do that? The workers certainly don't have that financial means. They are working for each day, a day's wage. So generosity here is couched with envy. Some translations depict the workers' envy as being their evil eye. And we use similar phrases, right? Sometimes we call out somebody's evil eye, but sometimes we also say something like, jealousy is the green-eyed monster eyes. It's important to point out here that Matthew talks about eyes a lot. Matthew 5:29. If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. Matthew 6:22. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is unhealthy, your whole body is full. Or if your eye is healthy, your whole body is full of light. But if your eye is unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? We are hearing those echoes of eyes in Matthew. So perhaps they do cast their evil eye. But the owner responds with his one lone identity statement. His last words are, I am generous. And the workers have seen this. He has lived this out. He generously gave the last hired the usual daily wage. The first hired just thought differently about generosity, about equality, about fairness. Well, maybe they did. The first hired workers are not given a chance to respond to the owner. It is always important in all things, but also, especially in a parable, to look for who is given a voice and who is not. The landowner here is given the last word. So we're left to fill in the response of the workers. How do they react to this owner's statement of I am generous? Do they continue to be envious? Do they walk away and grumble to others about the landowner and how they were cheated? Do they feel convicted and repent? We don't know. So we have to fill in what that response would be. And mine is still, like yours, it's not fair. Thanks for calling yourself generous. It's still not fair. The first hired people worked longer and harder. They deserve to be paid above what the others received. It's just not fair. But with that initial perspective, I don't really gain much meaningfulness in my life from this parable. So then, if I am to get any meaning out of it, the parable causes me to turn my perspective and think about fairness differently. Because fairness is not necessarily equality. For many people, in many organizations, especially nonprofits, fairness is more like the concept of equity. It isn't about making sure everyone gets the same, because the truth is, everyone is not the same. Everyone's situations are not the same. Everyone's needs are not the same. Fairness and equity are about treating people according to their needs. And this doesn't always mean equal. Through our church partnership, I've had the opportunity to connect with several of the Lakota people living on the Cheyenne River Reservation. And having experienced a small fraction of what life is like on the reservation, it's clear that equal isn't always fair. As we've said, the landowner makes a point to have the first hired watch what he does for the last hired and how he treats them. It almost seems like the landowner is intentionally agitating, antagonizing even the first hired. He makes them watch while everyone else gets paid. And he doesn't refute them when they say he has made the others equal to them. He also doesn't invite them to join in this blessing of this bounty. He calls them out. And just as the owner seems to intentionally antagonize the first hired, so it seems Jesus again is doing it to us. In parables, when Jesus agitates, when he stirs up the water, he is turning our focus to where it already should have been. In this case, it's with the last hired. The last hired are the least hireable, the ones no one wants, those on the fringe, the overlooked, or, from one view, the most sinful. They've been standing in the marketplace all day, but hardly seen. In our conversation about this parable in the Wednesday night Bible study, which we're doing, which everyone should come to, especially because you might get mentioned by name in the sermon, we talked about the people who are hired last. Who are they in our lives? Who are the people who make us feel uncomfortable? Who are the ones we feel should not be made equal to ourselves? Who are the ones we feel society should not accept? And are we even self-aware enough to recognize that we are shunning these people, whether we are doing it intentionally or not? Jesus has the first hired watch everyone get paid, have their needs met, so they see exactly who the owner is making them equal to. The first watch the last, and watch the owner put the last first. In student ministry, we talk a lot about the platinum rule, how it's different, but still the same as the golden rule. The golden rule, paraphrasing from Jesus' own words in Matthew, says, treat others the way you would like to be treated. Words to live by. The platinum rule goes just a bit further. Treat others the way they would like to be treated. The platinum rule adds an element of empathy on our part. It means putting ourselves in someone else's shoes, walking around a bit, and coming to a deeper understanding of how they would like to be treated by us. It means knowing the needs of another person and doing all we can to meet those needs. That, to me, is Jesus' call in this parable. If the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner, and the landowner's lone identity statement is, I am generous, then it is our responsibility to live into this identity as well. And it must be pointed out. The landowner doesn't say, I have been generous in this thing, or in this instance, I have done what is generous. The landowner says, I am generous. And that's our call. To be generous in all things and with all people, to embody generosity and live in this way. Generosity takes so many forms. Yes, there is financial generosity. There is also generosity with time, generosity of care, of love, of empathy. Generosity in advocacy, in devoting ourselves and seeking justice, in being a voice for the voiceless. Generosity is what we do with our beings. And like the landowner, many of us do have the blessing of being able to choose how we are generous and how much we are generous. Our call is to embody and personify generosity in all the hours of the day and with all people, seeing the needs of others, truly seeing them, and meeting them in fairness and with empathy. May we live into this.